And this particular story didn't happen directly to me, but it did happen to a relative of mine who lived in Mexico about 3 or 4 years ago. I live in the United States, and I'll start by giving some backstory about my relative, whom I'll refer to as Teo in this story. To be quite honest, I wasn't really that close to Teo. I only ever had one interaction with him growing up, and it wasn't in person. Instead, it was through MSN when it used to be relevant. Yeah, I'm a little on the older side. But I believe that I was around 13 years old when Teo messaged me out of the blue with the usual, "Hello and how are you?" However, the message that he sent that day caught my attention when he asked me something along the lines of, what clique or gang I belonged to. I'm ashamed to say that when I was a teenager, I did have friends involved in gangs, and I was starting to dabble in them myself, but I didn't mention it to him. I'm no longer involved with any gangs, and am far from the teenager I used to be long before the outcome of the story took place, if you're curious. But anyways, I was in the living room when Teo messaged me, as the only computer we had at the time was there, and it was right next to the main hallway of my home, so my mom saw the message. She was infuriated that Teo would ask me such a question, and she scolded me for having been messaging Teo in the first place. I was surprised at this, since most Mexican families are very family-oriented, and I brought that up to her. And this is where I learned for the first time a little more about the darker side of Teo and some of his family. My mom explained that Teo's father and uncle have a long history of being involved with gangs in Mexico, with Teo's father being the leader of a gang and Teo's uncle having joined it as well. She mentioned that we've run into Teo's uncle on multiple occasions when we've gone to get our vehicle looked at by a mechanic since she worked as one. Teo's uncle wore an eye patch, and I brought that up to her. She told me that the reason he wears it is that back when he was living in Mexico, Teo's father was getting jumped by a rival gang, and when the uncle found out, he immediately went to help fight them off. Unfortunately for him, one of the rival members had a morning star and threw the spike ball end onto the uncle's face, causing his eye to burst. And now Teo was following in their footsteps, so my mom wanted me to stay away from him and no longer communicate with him either. Teo's mother lived in the States at the time to pursue better pay to send money to her kids back in Mexico, so you can see why he was interested in gangs. Skip forward 2 years later. Teo's mother caught wind of him being heavily involved in gangs, and now officially being a member of his father's gang, and she leaves the States to go back to Mexico to stop him. That, my friends, was the last I had heard from them until about 3 or 4 years ago, when I heard the first bit of news of what happened to Teo. The first thing I heard was that Teo had gone about a month and a half without being seen or heard from, and that his family was looking for him. Unfortunately, the situation escalated to the point where his and his best friend's bodies were found in a ditch about an hour away from the village my family is from. Both of them had been tied up with a bullet hole in their head, having been executed. To this day, no one knows exactly what he did for work, or at least his direct relatives haven't told the rest of the family. Based on how he would go pretty far away and go about 2 weeks without communicating with anyone, some of us speculate that his work had something to do with capturing hostages and demanding ransom money. Others believe that he was involved with El Huachico, which entails stealing fuel from tank trucks to sell gasoline at a lower price than gasoline stations do. Of course, the group of killers weren't caught and probably never will be. The justice system, police force, and any other branch responsible for investigating deaths in Mexico are all corrupted by power and money. That could care less about investigating another murderer or two. It's not like the US, unfortunately. Now you may be thinking, what happened to the mother then? I thought she left to stop him from doing things like that. Well, my family comes from a poor background, so money was always scarce, and we are a pretty big family. When his mother left the States, she definitely did her best to try and stop him, but she soon saw how much money Teo was making and giving to the family, driving nice cars and such. And needless to say, she let him continue with whatever he was doing as long as they were living well. Most of the family was devastated, and I was surprised at first, but since I never really knew him that well, I can't say that I was too affected. I know I'm being insensitive about the situation, But that's what happens when you get involved with the wrong crowd. Fortunately for me, I stopped getting involved with the wrong crowd a long, long time ago. Whenever I read or hear stories of real-life horror, more times than not they're rarely resolved or, at the very least, remain wildly unsolved and very mysterious. And the story I'm about to share is a little on the darker side, but as you will see, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. This isn't your typical scary story. There's no ghosts or ghouls, no stalkers or creeps, just the real horror of a loved one struggling. My dad had some inner demons, and my mom struggled with depression. But the real problem in my family was my cousin Jeremy. Jeremy was a troublemaker from a young age. He would steal from stores, lie to his parents, and bully other kids. But as he got older, his behavior got worse. He started getting into fights, and he dropped out of school. He was only a year younger than me, but he was already out of school by the end of his 10th grade year. And as the years went on, life didn't get any better for Jeremy. His relationship at home with his parents got worse with every new year that passed. When I was in college, I had my own place, and I invited Jeremy to come stay with me for a few weeks. I thought that it would be good for him to get away from his troubled home life for a while. But I quickly realized that things were worse than I had thought. Jeremy would disappear for hours at a time, and when he came back, he was always messed up or under the influence of something. He would talk about how he was going to start some kind of crime empire and become rich. It seemed that the older he got, the more entranced with that crime-filled lifestyle he became. I always tried to talk to him to get him to see how dangerous his behavior was, but he wouldn't listen. One night, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I had previously thought that my apartment was being broken into. I went to investigate, and I found Jeremy in the living room, smashing everything in sight. I could still see the image of my cousin clearly in my mind when I think back to that horrible night. He was screaming. His eyes were wild, and against my better judgment, I tried to calm him down, but he just became more agitated. He picked up a lamp while it was still plugged into the wall and threw it at me. I managed to avoid it, but I realized that I needed to get out of there. It was as if he hadn't even noticed that I was there when he threw the lamp. The sort of cold and vicious look was in his eyes, and it kind of looked right through me. Whatever the instance of rage was, it wasn't getting any better with me trying to talk to him. Unfortunately, there was only one thing left for me to do, and I knew that it was going to be hard. I called the police, and thankfully they arrived quickly. They managed to subdue Jeremy, but he put up a fight. There really isn't anything quite like watching the physical struggle of a family member and the cops when they're standing only about 5 feet away from you. As they led him away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I looked at him one last time in the back of the car, and the fear evolved into sadness. He just stared straight into the distance, like the lights were on, but nobody was home, metaphorically. I didn't even recognize him as my cousin anymore. I knew that Jeremy needed help, but I also knew that I couldn't be the one to give it to him. After that incident, I didn't hear from Jeremy for a long time. But then, one day, I got a call from his mother. She told me that he had been arrested for stealing from a string of homes in the neighborhood where we grew up and that he was facing charges for burglary. I was shocked. I knew that Jeremy had always been a troublemaker and he always talked a big game, but I had never thought that he would resort to real-life burglary. I asked his mother what had happened, and she told me that Jeremy had fallen in with an extremely bad crowd. A lot worse than the crowd he used to hang out with back in the day. They had convinced him to start stealing things, and it had quickly spiraled out of control. Jeremy was now facing serious legal trouble, and his future looked pretty bleak. I felt a sense of sadness and even regret. I knew that I had to try and help Jeremy, but I failed. I had been too focused on his behavior, and I hadn't paid enough attention to his struggles, whenever they may have been. Over the next few months, I tried to stay in touch with Jeremy. I sent him letters and called him in jail, but it was clear that he was still struggling. Eventually, Jeremy was released from jail, and he had a hard time getting his life back on track. He had burned bridges with his family, and he couldn't find a job because of his criminal record. I tried to help him as much as I could, but it was clear that he needed professional help. He began going to therapy, and slowly, but surely he started to turn his life around. It wasn't easy, but Jeremy eventually got a job and moved into his own apartment. He started taking responsibility for his actions, and he made amends with his family. It was a slow process, but it was also a reminder of the importance of not giving up on somebody even when they seemed beyond help. Jeremy had hit rock bottom, but he had found a way to climb back up, and in the end, he emerged stronger for it. My stepmother Maggie had always been kind of distant. From the moment she married my father, I knew that there was something kind of off about her. She was cold and calculating, always keeping her distance from me and my siblings. I never understood why my father had married her, but I had tried to make the best of the situation. As the years went on, my relationship with Maggie kind of deteriorated. She became increasingly hostile towards me, blaming me for things that I had no control over. And she would often say hurtful things to me, like how I had taken her son away from her and how I wasn't good enough for my father. Whenever I would bring this up to my dad, he would tell me that I was the one being crazy. To this day, I still have no idea what she meant when she would yell at me for quote-unquote taking her son from her. And despite her behavior, I tried to be civil with her. I didn't want to cause any trouble, and I knew that my father loved her for some reason. She may have been jealous since we all loved my mom's new husband, but didn't share the same love for Maggie. As the years continued, our relationship was rocky at best. I went away to college, after high school, and then after I graduated, I moved into my own place right away. I didn't see my dad a lot, which really sucked. I loved him and I knew he loved me, but Maggie was enough of a deterrent that it just didn't happen a lot. I lived about 40 minutes away from them, so it wasn't around the corner, but I would have made the trip at any time if my dad called. A few years after graduation, I ended my long-term relationship and lived alone for the first time in my entire life. I don't like being alone in general, but it's especially hard after a breakup. Right around this time, my father and Maggie split up, which was just about the only good news of my life at this point. I talked to my dad, and we decided that when he came back from his business trip, I would move back in with him. I was so excited to be a part of my father's life again, since we were basically strangers at this time in my life. I asked about Maggie, and he didn't really go into detail, but basically summed everything up by saying that all of us kids were right about her all along. While my father was away on his trip, I packed up my entire place in 2 days, and I was ready to move when he came back in a couple more days. One of those nights I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something hitting my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just a branch from a nearby tree, but the sound persisted. I cautiously got out of bed and peeked out the window, but I didn't see anything. I made my way to the kitchen to get some water to try to calm my nerves a bit. As I walked back towards my bedroom, I saw something that still makes me shudder when I think about it, and just the memory alone gives me goosebumps. Standing in the middle of my room was my former stepmother, Maggie. She was staring at me with a dead look in her eyes. I was frozen with fear, not knowing what to do. My voice began to tremble as I asked, "What are you doing here?" She smiled at me, a smile that I had never once received in all the years she was with my father. I could sense a shred of irony in her face as she said, "I just wanted to see you, darling." I didn't know what to do. My stepmother had always been distant, and I couldn't understand why she would be here in the middle of the night breaking into my house. I tried to reason with her and get her to leave, but she was insistent on staying. And as the night wore on, Maggie grew more and more agitated. She started to talk about things that made no sense. She kept bringing up the strange arguments from a long time ago, like how I had taken away her son and how I needed to pray. I was terrified. She wouldn't let me. My phone was on the kitchen counter, and I didn't know how I was going to get out of the bedroom. And suddenly, she lunged at me, and I fell to the ground. She was now on top of me, and I could feel her hot breath on my face. I struggled to get free, but she was too strong. And with a menacing look in her eyes she shouted, "I won't let you take him away from me." In a moment of weakness, she let her guard down and I managed to wriggle free and run out of the room, and I locked the door behind me. Because there are no locks on the outside of the door, I grabbed a chair that was in the hallway and propped it under the handle so she remained stuck in that room. I could hear her pounding on the door, screaming my name. I was terrified and I didn't know what to do. All I could think to do was call the police, and thank God they arrived within minutes. They found my stepmother still in my room, just kind of muttering to herself. They arrested her and took her away, but the terrifying memory of that night has stayed with me for a long time. After that night, I was afraid to be alone, and thankfully my dad came home the next night, so I didn't actually have to be alone. I couldn't sleep without the lights on, and I was always looking over my shoulder, afraid that she would come back for me. I couldn't understand why she had done what she did, but I knew that I could never forgive her this time. I tried to move on from that night, but the memory of my stepmother breaking into my house in the middle of the night still haunts my mind. I'll never forget the fear and helplessness that I felt in that night, and I'll never forget that dead look in her eyes. I always knew my family was a little eccentric, but I never realized just how crazy they were until I moved back home from college. It started with little things at first, I guess. I would hear strange noises coming from the basement, doors opening and closing on their own, but it quickly escalated into something far more terrifying. My uncle had always been a bit of an oddball. He lived in a sort of ramshackle house in the woods surrounded by junk and old cars. He rarely left his property, and when he did, he was usually to wander the nearby woods, muttering to himself. Yes, I was one of those people that had a family member who literally wandered in the woods like a madman. My family didn't talk about him much, but I always got the sense that they were afraid of him, and trust me, I can see why. He looked like how a wilderness serial killer would look in a movie or something. Long and wild hair and a massively long and mangy beard, and he had no teeth and was always so dirty. One night, I woke up to the sound of shuffling footsteps outside my bedroom door. I assumed it was just my dad getting up to use the bathroom, but then I heard a strange scratching noise. It sounded like someone was running their nails along the doorframe. I sat up in bed, and my heart was pounding, and I called out to my dad. But there was no response. The scratching continued, getting louder and more frantic. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But then I heard a voice. It was sort of a low and guttural sound, and it sounded like it was coming from deep within someone's throat. "Let me in," it said. I screamed and jumped out of bed, fumbling for the light switch, and when the room was finally illuminated, I saw that the door handle was flipping back and forth as if though someone was trying to get in. But thankfully it stopped after a few seconds. When I hadn't heard anything for several minutes, I did the most logical thing I could do in that moment. I ran to my parents' bedroom, babbling about the voice and the scratching. My dad got up to check the house, but he didn't find anything out of the ordinary. I was too scared to go back to sleep, so I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. The next day, my dad sat me down and told me the truth about my uncle. He wasn't just eccentric, but he was in fact dangerous. He had a history of mental illness, and he had been in and out of institutions for most of his adult life. My dad continued to tell me that my grandma, his mom, also suffered from some type of mental illness that went undiagnosed for her entire life. I never knew my grandparents on that side of the family. They had passed away before I was even born, so I have no memories of my grandma being unruly or violent. The scratching and the voice were just the beginning though, my dad said. If we didn't do something about it, things could get much worse. We tried to avoid talking about my uncle as much as possible, but it was hard to ignore the feeling of unease that hung over the house. Every time I heard a strange noise, or saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I wondered if it was him. One night, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass, and I crept down the hallway to check it out, and my heart began to pound in my chest. When I got to the living room, I saw that the window had been smashed in, and that there was a trail of mud leading towards the stairs. I knew then that my uncle must have gotten inside the house. I woke up my parents again and we barricaded ourselves in their bedroom, but it didn't take long for my uncle to break through the door. He was wild-eyed, wielding a knife in one hand and something else in the other hand, but I couldn't see what it was through all the chaos. I won't go into details of what happened next. Suffice it to say that it was the most terrifying night of my life. We were lucky to make it out alive. Truly lucky. My uncle was eventually caught and taken back to an institution, but the damage had been done. I still have nightmares about him, about the scratching, and the voice, and the way he looked at me with such hatred in his eyes. I try to tell myself that it's all in the past, that I'm safe now. But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching and waiting for his next opportunity to strike. My family and I never spoke about that night again, but we all knew that we had been forever changed by that experience. We became more cautious and paranoid. Every little creak and groan of the house put us on edge, and we jumped at every unexpected noise. For a while, I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. I was afraid that if I did, I would run into my uncle or someone like him. And it wasn't until I met my now husband who encouraged me to face my fears and seek help that I began to slowly recover from the trauma. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that my family is cursed or something. That there's something in our DNA that makes us susceptible to madness and violence. I try not to dwell on it too much, but there are moments when I catch myself wondering if I'm the next one to snap. I've tried to distance myself from my family as much as possible, but sometimes it feels like they're always there, lurking in the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully escape the legacy of my crazy family member, but I'm determined to try. I live in a small town with my parents, my older brother, and my aunt who lived with us. My aunt was my mother's sister, and she had always been a little strange. Never in a bad way, just off for some reason. More awkward than anything else. She was never married and she didn't have any children of her own, so she spent a lot of time with our family. Growing up, my aunt was always kind to me, but there was something unsettling about her. She had a strange way of looking at me, as if though she was trying to see something inside of me. As I got older, I started to notice that my aunt's behavior was getting more and more erratic. She would disappear for hours at a time, and when she came back, she would be covered in scratches and bruises. One day, when I was about 15, my aunt disappeared for several days. I remember this being a tense time in the household. My parents would have these secret arguments about her. At the time, I really didn't think too much about it, but now I wonder why we never reached out to any authorities. My mother knew her better than most, and I assumed she just accepted that this was a part of my aunt's character. When she finally returned, she was acting even stranger than before. She would stare off into space for long periods of time, and she would talk to herself in hushed tones. Whenever I tried to talk to her, she wouldn't respond to me for the longest time. That's when I started to notice things going missing from our house. At first, it was just small things like pens and books, and then it started to escalate. My mother's jewelry went missing, and then my brother's laptop disappeared. We searched the house, but we couldn't find any trace of the missing items. I started to suspect that my aunt was the one taking things, but I didn't want to believe it. She had always been kind to me, even though she was strange, and I didn't want to think that she could do something like that. But then one day I caught her in the act. I had come home from school early, and I saw my aunt sneaking out of my brother's room with his new laptop in her hands. When I confronted her, she just looked at me with those sort of strange eyes and told me that she was borrowing it. But I knew that wasn't true. I suspected that I knew what was going on. After that, things started to get even more disturbing. My aunt would sit in her room for hours on end, just talking to herself in this sort of low, almost insidious voice. Sometimes I could hear her laughing maniacally. My parents didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. They continually told me it was just my imagination, but I knew that something was very, very off. Then one day, my aunt disappeared again. This time she was gone for over a week. When she came back, she was just different. Her eyes were wild and bloodshot, and she was covered in scratches and what seemed to be bite marks. She wouldn't tell us where she had been or what had happened to her. This was the first time I finally witnessed my parents being rational adults and at least attempting to take action. I remember them spending time researching her behaviors and even contemplating calling the police, but ultimately decided against it. And that's when things started to get really scary. One night, I woke up and heard what sounded like scattering footsteps. I would have chalked it up to an overactive dream, but I noticed my door was half open when I opened my eyes, and I always sleep with my door shut. It's one of those things that I religiously check before I go to bed. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake this feeling of dread. I must have dozed off eventually, because I ended up waking up to the sound of laughter. When I opened my eyes, I could see my aunt standing at the edge of my bed with an empty glass vase. She was muttering to herself in that same low, insidious voice, and I could see her eyes in the low-lit bedroom was completely blank. I screamed for my parents, and they came rushing in to find my aunt holding the vase. When they started to approach my aunt, lunged for me, and tried to strike me with a vase, but my dad was able to knock the vase from her hands. My mom grabbed her and sat her in the corner of the room, screaming in her face while she was essentially holding her down. I ran to the living room with my dad and just heard the almost unnatural sounds of my aunt screaming and laughing. We had to call the police finally, and my aunt was taken away to some sort of mental hospital, I guess, and it turned out that she had been suffering from severe schizophrenia. And she had been experiencing hallucinations and delusions. But that didn't make it any less terrifying for me and my family. This is a serious disorder, and it's not always like how it's portrayed in movies and shows. It's actually more sad than scary when I think about it in hindsight. I remember as a teenager, I assumed her problem was something much different. I figured that she was stealing the stuff around the house to support her illegal activities, but there was no evidence of that in her system at all, which it makes the question, where did she take all that stuff she stole, and where did she receive all those bruises and marks on her body? Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night and just the experience with my aunt. I can still see my aunt's just sort of wild, blank look. I can still hear her muttering to herself in that low, horrifying voice. It's a memory that I'll never forget. Growing up, my sister and I were best friends. We shared everything and did everything together. However, as we got older, things started to change. My sister, Jenna, became increasingly distant and moody, and I started to connect with her. She lost most of her friends in school and made zero effort to rekindle any of those fractured relationships. One summer, we decided to go on a camping trip together and attempt to bond and recreate the relationship we once had. Then and now I would do anything for my sister, and this was the best idea I had to reconnect. We went to a remote part of the woods where we would be alone with nature. At first, it was great. We spent our days hiking and exploring and our nights around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. But as the days wore on, I started to notice something strange about Jenna. She became obsessed with finding a certain spot in the woods, and she would spend hours studying maps and walking to town so she could talk to the locals. She wouldn't tell me what she was looking for, but I could sense that it was something important to her, and I just wanted to be supportive. I was interested because whatever she wanted to find was probably something I'd like too, at least that's what I thought. I assumed it was some sort of local folklore, which is something she and I have always enjoyed. No matter how hard I pried though, Jenna would not tell me what she was looking for and just told me to mind my own business. One morning before dawn, while still on our trip, I woke up to find Jenna gone. I searched the campsite, but she was nowhere to be found. I panicked and searched the woods in near darkness, calling out her name. And after hours of searching, I was beyond relieved that I had finally found her. I couldn't believe it. After hours of looking, she was only 10 feet away. She was sitting alone in a clearing, staring off into space. "Jenna? What are you doing out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked at me and gave me a little smile and said, "I found it. I finally found it." I looked at her with confusion and said, "What did you find?" She looked at me like a child on her birthday and said, "The portal." I didn't understand what she was talking about, but I could tell that she was excited. She led me to a spot in the woods where I saw a small circular clearing. In the center of the clearing, there was a strange symbol carved into the ground. Feeling a little strange about the entire situation, I asked her, "What is it?" Jenna's eyes grew wide, and she looked at me with a big smile again and said, "It's a portal." I looked with bewilderment at her, and then she said, "Well, not just a portal, it's the portal, the one I've been looking for." I had no idea how to react to that. There was nothing unique or strange about the symbol. It was literally just a symbol on the ground. Jenna could have put it there for all I knew. I tried to convince her to leave, but she was determined to stay. She told me that the portal would lead her to a world beyond her own, a world where she could be truly happy. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. And this is when I started to realize that something was not right. She eventually came back to the campsite to eat a couple of handfuls of chips, and then she went to bed. As the last few days of our trip carried on, Jenna spent more and more time at the portal. She would sit there for hours, staring at the symbol, lost in thought. I tried to talk to her, but she seemed distant and uninterested. It was as if though I wasn't even there. On the last day of the trip, I woke up to find Jenna gone again. This time I knew where to find her. I made my way to the portal, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was Jenna, with her arms outstretched. Her eyes were closed, and it looked almost like she was praying. Suddenly, she put her arms down and stood still as a statue again. And she turned to me, which surprised me because I didn't know that she knew I was there, and she said, "This is your fault. You're the reason the portal won't work." She started to sob uncontrollably. It wasn't easy, but I was finally able to get Jenna into the car, and we made the several-hour drive home. I tried to talk with her the entire time, but she wouldn't talk to me, except for the occasional "I hate you." When we got home, she went to her room, closed the door, and I don't think I've ever had a real conversation with her again. She moved away not long after that. Even my parents really couldn't get her to stay. And it's been years since that camping trip, and I still don't have any answers. I've tried so many times to reach out to her, but she wants nothing to do with me. I have no idea how she began to think like that. I have no idea if maybe she was on some type of LSD or some type of hallucinogen. I have no idea. But I guess I know she's doing okay at least. We're friends on Facebook, and apparently she has a fiancé, but she won't talk to me or family for some reason. I can at least feel good in the fact that she's alright. I've gone to that campsite and even the so-called portal several times, and I hadn't found anything. I have no idea what caused Jenna to just essentially snap and lose her mind, and why she won't talk to any of us. I still hold out hope that one day Jenna and I will reconnect and I'll have my sister back for good.